Hey all, back with another Spotlight with Context, and today we are talking about Count Nefaria, the most overpowered villain you've never heard of. For those who are curious, Count Nefaria is an old Marvel villain. He's Italian mafia connections. He's shown up in a bunch of various storylines, but basically he's a Superman pastiche as an energy vampire. I think they're translated well here. There's definitely an emphasis on the energy vampire stuff and a fair amount of Superman in the animations. I think y'all will really enjoy him. Some of you have already seen either the spotlight or the outtake of the spotlight that was in the live stream, but let's just dive right in with the champion attributes. So first off, survivability of 4. Nefaria has a couple very relevant immunities, some very strong damage resistances, and the ability to steal health from the opponent, plus he's very synergistic with inequity. All of these things come together to just make a very survivable character. There's a little bit of risk in his playstyle. He's not like tanky with a capital T. If you get hit, you can still die, but there's just a lot of mitigation and regen built into the kit that definitely makes a 4 appropriate. Damage of 4, this is going to swing a bit depending on what you're fighting, right? In a completely vanilla fight, if you just take him into... Winter Soldier is a bad example because of class disadvantage, but if you take him into a fight like that where nothing's really going on, he's going to feel pretty medium. You're going to build up to a special 2, you're going to do all of the right things, you're going to land a special 2, you're going to get a solid amount of damage, but it's not going to feel special, right? But that is more than balanced out, in my opinion, by the matchups where he pops off. Basically, anywhere where the opponent is trying to heal or gain power, anywhere where you can really capitalize on his vulnerabilities, he feels fantastic. Not like CGR nuke level fantastic, which is why this is still a 4, but yeah, he's absolutely going to be enough in the matchups where you should be using him. And we'll kind of talk about those complexities as we go. Ease of use 2.5. Nefaria is another character, I like to say this, where if you just combo in special, you'll be fine, right? If you just hit the opponent a bunch, use special 1, then special 2, you'll get okay results. So his ease of use can't be that low because of that, right? However, Nefaria asks you to parry specials in a very particular way, parrying the last hit of them as a counter evade, so that you either actually punish the special with the counter hit evade, kind of like you were using Elsa, or by doing that evade and then finding a place for your medium right after it. And that's where his best damage, where his best flow comes from. And that takes some serious getting used to. I personally find it quite trippy at first, but I got into the groove of it, and it's super fun. He's very, very cool to play. Try it out for, get a low rarity one. Try it out for at least a few minutes before you decide it's not for you. But it is a real skill ask, right? So that's how we arrived at 2.5. Utility of 4, we already talked about immunities and resistances. DLL, why do you double count those for survivability and utility? Because they are both, I know I've said that before, but yeah, especially the power steal immunity is very relevant utility. We just saw another power steal threat on defense with Enchantress last month. Nefaria is power steal immune in addition to his damage immunities. There's excellent power and regen control here. Just a very strong character. And then Defender Strength of 2.5. The animations are really obnoxious, I'm not going to lie to you. He does put debuffs on you, which sometimes becomes a problem, but most of his kit is not focused on being a defender, and as long as you're not using somebody who would be one of his target matchups against him, a lot of his kit's never really going to come online defensively. So 2.5 is about right. If you do use someone who is a target matchup, or spoiler alert, if you throw power backs on someone and turn them into a target matchup for him, some bad things might happen, but generally it's fine. Moving on to strengths and weaknesses. We've talked about this already, but against somebody who gains health or power gain, he just gets supercharged. He naturally accrues his resource through playing, but as the opponent gains extra power or extra health, he gains that resource faster, and then everything else works better, is basically what you're going with there. Evading special attacks is really cool. He's not going to be able to evade Mangog's Special 2 the way that Silk can, right? It's not like that. But if there's a really dangerous last hit of a special, and you can kind of avoid everything but that, but then get your block up, you don't have to worry about how much damage it would have done through block because you actually evade it. Again, it's not meant to trivialize specials. You do still have to respect them, but especially if you're dealing with somebody who would go unblockable right at the end or do a lot of damage through block, he can be really helpful against that. And then applying debuffs, like I said, he just applies debuffs automatically through playing, and he gets quite a few of them, so anywhere that matters, he's better. And he can turn on non-contact attacks. He doesn't have these natively, right? His basic attacks deal physical damage, but when he goes into his super mode, all of his attacks become non-contact, and so then are good for things like not ramping Kindred or Warlock. Now, weaknesses. If your kit relies on applying debuffs, then an opponent who is debuff immune or otherwise gets rid of them is going to be a problem. It's pretty standard for science. Now, Nefaria is immune to bleed, but if he's not fighting a mystic, bleed will still chip away at his resource, and so you don't want to be using him to fight, say, a cosmic on a bleed node, because everything would just kind of fall apart as you go. And then evade punishment. As we've talked about, to really get his damage going, Nefaria kind of needs to be able to evade, and so any opponent that turns that off, whether through ability accuracy or something like true accuracy or true focus, is going to make things that much worse. Now, getting into the abilities themselves, we already talked about this, but Nefaria's body is composed of Ionic Energy. That's flavor text. Please don't try and make that hook into something else. But what that actually means is that he is immune to Power Steal and Bleed, and has 90% resistance to Shock and Incinerate. Now remember, 90% resistance to Shock and Incinerate is often better than immunity, because it means if they're debuffs, he will be able to heal from them thanks to willpower, so that's very, very potent. And then immunity to bleed, always helpful. Like I mentioned earlier, immunity to Power Steal is generally nice. There are a number of places that this comes up, but it's especially good against someone like Enchantress, because one of her spookiest threats is that when her opponent is immune to something, she will Power Steal them. And that means that one of the places that you're going to be seeing her is going to be on hazard shift nodes. And so being immune to both the bleed and the resulting Power Steal is very, very helpful against somebody like her. So, moving on to energy buildup, this is Nefaria's core resource. Some of this may not make sense until later, so don't worry about that too much. Whenever the opponent fills a bar of power, they gain 15 stored energy. This is just behind the scenes. And then for every 1% of the opponent's max health or power they would gain, so this is before any reductions come in, they would gain from a buff or a passive, they gain 2 stored energy. Like it clarifies here, this is unaffected by reduced regen or ability power rates. So if your opponent, let's say that Mystic Dispersion activates and they try to gain 12% of their max power, this reads that as 12% of their max power. It doesn't matter if you're reducing their ability power rate to 0 or even inverting it, right? It doesn't matter that they didn't actually gain power. What matters is they tried to gain 12%, and so they will gain 24 stored energy thanks to this ability here. Now, all of that stored energy, you don't need to necessarily understand all of the numbers. The important part is that every 10 stored energy is automatically converted into an indefinite energy buildup debuff on the opponent. And then these debuffs are going to be used for everything else. I also want to call out, like I mentioned earlier, these debuffs being on the opponent means that Nefaria can sit at the cap for the Inequity Mastery of 6 debuffs on the opponent at pretty much all times, giving him effectively 54% extra health. It means he synergizes very well with Despair, which makes his regen rate control into actual regen reversal. These debuffs are quite good, generally. But again, for the most part, you don't have to worry about the precise mechanics of this section. You just have to know that you want your opponent to gain bars of power, and you want them to try to gain health and power from buffs and passives. Note that the buffs and passives part here doesn't include effects like willpower, because that's not a passive, right? That's just an uninteractable health gain. That's the kind of thing that you're going to need to keep an eye out for, but most effects are buffs or passives. All right, next up, we've already talked about the evade a little bit, but let's really dig into it here. When Count Nefaria would block a basic attack or the final hit of a special attack with a well-timed block or just after a well-timed block, he has a 100% chance to evade instead. That's a relatively new sentence, even though it's describing something we've seen before, so let's talk about the two halves of it. Block a basic attack, this is just the Elsa, Kate, Spider-Punk ability, right? Instead of blocking the basic, he counterattacks, or he evades and then counterattacks. The other part is that when you're looking at the last hit of a special, you try to well-time block it, he evades. The just after portion is covering you in a niche case, right? Imagine that you were facing Cyclops, right? He throws his special one and it's got those 3 hits from the beams all tightly clustered together. What this is saying is that you can parry the first beam and Nefaria will block that and then evade the last one. As long as it's within that window, he'll give you credit for it, but this is to basically account for those special animations where there's a hit so close to the last one that you wouldn't actually be able to parry it without avoiding the hit in front of it, right? So, it plays simpler than it is. The extra complexity there is mainly just to make your life easier when trying to do his thing. So this evade has a cooldown of 11 seconds, but that cooldown is ignored for evading special attacks. That means that if you're trying to do the Kate thing and parry a basic, that is subject to the cooldown, but anytime your opponent throws a special attack, you can parry and evade the final hit of that special. And then the cooldown will come back and keep ticking. It's not a reset for the cooldown, it is truly just ignored for that particular case. When evading, Count Nefaria counterattacks. You've heard me say this a few times already. This counter hit deals a burst of energy damage and inflicts 2 energy buildups. So you get 2 debuffs for free here, regardless of how much health or power the opponent has gained. As a quick pacing note, this means that even if your opponent is not gaining health or power, if you push them to a special and then parry and evade the final hit of it, you are already at 3.5 basically energy buildups. Because remember, them gaining a bar gives them 15 energy, 10 of that is turned into a debuff. You parrying the final hit gives you another 2. So if you do that twice and parry the final hit of 2 special ones, you're at 7 buildups on the opponent. Again, you don't necessarily need to actively track this. It's not particularly important, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what the baseline economy of these buildups is. 2 special ones, roughly 7. Next up, if the opponent's special attack is punished after evading it, meaning you do this evade and then you hit them before they get out of their recovery animation, either with the counterattack or with your own medium after the counterattack. Both are fine. Then you inflict a chunky energy vulnerability debuff for 18 seconds. Nefaria's best damage payout is energy, and so you really want this energy vulnerability. This right here is the real reason to be scared of evade counters with Nefaria, because you can make up for the 2 energy buildups it gives you, but your fight's going to be significantly slower if you don't have access to this energy vulnerability. Next up, we have Ionic Charges. You can gain 10 Ionic Charges whenever performing a well-timed block, and you lose 20 Ionic Charges when Count Nefaria would be inflicted with a bleed effect while fighting a non-mystic champion. So we talked about this earlier. This is why you just want to avoid bleed if you're not fighting a mystic. If you are fighting a mystic, like Enchantress, it's totally fine, but losing 20 every time a bleed comes in is pretty devastating. Ionic Charges grant up to, I think that's roughly doubling his base attack rating, maxing out at 100 charges, meaning that if you have 100 charges, or if you have 300 charges, this is the attack rating you get. If you have 50 charges, you get half of that. And then they also grant a lot of physical and energy resistance, and up to 90% degen resistance, also maxing out at 100. So again, if you're at 100 or anywhere over 100, you just get the benefits listed here. If you're under 100, then you just get that proportion of these benefits. Now, normally, here's where I say the reason you care about gaining Ionic Charges is this, but obviously those benefits are pretty nice too. But the payout for getting to 100 Ionic Charges beyond the scaling benefits is that you enter Ionic Overcharge. This is the super mode. This lasts for 17 seconds and is paused during Count Nefaria's special attacks, and when it expires, you lose 100 charges. Now notice there is no restriction here that says you can't gain more charges while Overcharge is active. So if you gain enough charges within that 17 seconds that it's there, you'll lose 100 charges and you'll just reactivate it again because you'll be over 100, right? So you can keep this up literally permanently, not even mostly indefinitely, but literally permanently, if you're fighting someone who's gaining enough health or power to feed you all of those charges. Now, during Ionic Overcharge, all of Count Nefaria's attacks are non-contact. Like we said earlier, that's very helpful for fighting somebody like Kindred, who ramps when you hit them with contact attacks. This also makes him a Thorns counter for that. And deal energy damage instead of physical. This has a number of effects, but the most obvious one is that now his basic attacks, all of them, are going to benefit from the energy vulnerability he's put on the opponent. So it's not just his red numbers that are benefiting from the vulnerability. When you're in Overcharge, it's all damage you do. So very helpful there. And then additionally, the opponent's regen and ability power rates are reduced by 95%. So just almost zeroed out in most cases. This will cut power in a vanilla fight down to 5%. So 1 in 20 of the power that they otherwise would have gained. And in most competitive content where the opponents are running the recovery mastery, you're going to go from 115 down to 20, so still an almost 5/6 reduction in how much health they are gaining. Of course, if you're running the despair mastery, which you should be, then you're going to take it down even further, and then this just becomes a potent heal reversal. And then on top of that reduction, whenever they gain ability power, so whenever they gain power from something other than being hit or landing hits, Nefaria gains 60% of the power denied this way. This is the same basic ability that Spidey Supreme and Absorbing Man have. This is the same basic ability that Spidey Supreme and Absorbing Man have if you're familiar with it on them. And it's got a pretty good uptime. Just to shout it out, if your opponent has no power and you've inverted their ability power rate, you won't gain anything. But note that in his own kit, Nefaria doesn't actually invert the opponent's power, so you will usually be gaining something. This also does look for how much you are actually reducing it. So it should work just fine on nodes that are boosting the opponent's ability power rate and still give you credit for the reduction. Moving on, for all special attacks, the first hit of any special deals a burst of energy damage if it's the first or second hit after Count Nefaria's counterattack hit. This means that if you can do the counterattack hit and immediately throw your special, so your inputs would basically just be parry special button, that gets the bonus. Additionally, you can go parry, wait for the hit to land, charge in with a medium, which is how I normally play Kate, Elsa, and Spider-Punk, and then after that medium, immediately throw your special attack, and you'll get this burst of energy damage that way too. There is a HUD icon to kind of help you learn this, but one way or another, if you can line up punishing specials and then immediately throwing your own specials, not only will you get free energy buildups, as we talked about earlier, not only will you get an energy vulnerability if you also manage to punish it, you're also going to immediately deal this burst of energy damage that benefits from that energy vulnerability. I want to pause for a second because I realize I've said a lot of things and this kit sounds very complex. And in a lot of ways it is. I'm not hiding that. But what my friend Vega sometimes calls flow in a kit is very strong here. The way I often talk about that term is that when you need an ability, it's there. Count Nefaria feels very well designed in that way to me, where each of these abilities that are individually complicated and can kind of make you go, what's the purpose of this? The purpose is that it feeds into something else the kit's already doing. And once you've figured out how to play him, once you've figured out bait the opponent's specials, ideally after gaining a bar of power myself, parry the last hit of the special, use that to punish the opponent, then immediately throw a special. Once you get that loop, everything lines up for you. And the kit just kind of feels like it's playing itself. It's a very, very smooth experience, even though I'm having to talk through some complexities here. So I wanted to take a second and address that. We move on to the special one here. The final 4 hits each devour 2 energy buildups. So that is why you're caring about putting all these energy buildups on the opponent. This can trigger through block. Hopefully that's not going to come up on offense, and is unaffected by ability accuracy, which is pretty important. Each debuff devoured this way grants 16 Ionic Charges, meaning that if you can devour even 7 of them, you automatically go into Ionic Overcharge, because that would be 112 charges, 2% of his missing health, and 9% of a bar of power. So, again, his kit works better if the opponent's trying to gain health or power. But let's back up to earlier where I said that if you bait out 2 special ones and parry and punish the final hit of those special ones, you're at 7 buildups. That means that when you then, after that second special parry punish, you throw your special one immediately, you're going to devour 7 of those buildups off of the opponent with your last 4 hits. You're going to gain 112 Ionic Charges, instantly enter Ionic Overcharge, you're going to get back 14% of your missing health, and you're going to get back 9 times 7, 63% of a bar of power, which means that because you baited out 2 special ones before throwing your special one, you were probably at about 1.5 bars of power. You spent 1, you already have more than a bar of power left. You can now run to the special 2. And you just healed, right? So you got back some of any chip damage that you took. Like I said, the kit flows really well. And I just want to point out how if you play him properly, even in a vanilla matchup, the special one is already setting you up for success with just the natural accumulation of resources. Moving on to the special 2. On activation, you get a Fury passive for every 10 Ionic Charges, lasting 16 seconds, and you can get up to 15 of them. Remember, Ionic Overcharge turns on when you're at 100, but there's no cap on Ionic Charges. You can keep going up and up and up. And so if you're facing somebody who's gaining a lot of health and who is putting a lot of energy buildup debuffs on themselves, then maybe instead of going special 1 directly to special 2, you threw 2 special 1s, and you just are sitting on a ton of Ionic Charges. That's when you get all of these Furies, all 15 of them, and you really are cooking with gas. But in a lot of fights, going special 1, special 2, like I said, is going to get you fine results. You're probably going to get 7, 8 Furies maybe, and this is going to feel good. Then the final hit is going to inflict an Incinerate debuff, which will scale with all of those Furies that you just got, and which will benefit from the energy vulnerabilities that you're trying to keep on your opponent. It's a pretty short Incinerate at only 6 seconds, but that means that it's also pretty chunky. When you are ramped properly, when you have those energy vulnerabilities up, when you have your Furies, it's a big Incinerate. And against Mystics, it's instead a Plasma, so you don't have to worry about your Mystic opponents being immune to Incinerate. Looking at you, Kindred. Moving on to the Special 3, this is your standard easy button, right? You gain 50 Ionic Charges without having to convert any build-up debuffs. You instantly activate Ionic Overcharge, and you pause it for 10 seconds. So even if you didn't have enough to go into Overcharge, you automatically get it, right? Your absolute fail case for this, let's say you're facing somebody who's purifying every debuff you put on them. You throw the Special 3, you have no other Ionic Charges. Well, you gain 50, you go into Overcharge, you get half of that attack boost, half of those resistances, half of that degen resistance we talked about, and you benefit from all of that for 17 seconds plus however many specials you throw, and then you just go back down to 0 when Ionic Overcharge expires. Which, I'm sorry, will not be 17 seconds plus specials, will be 27 seconds plus specials because it's paused for 10 seconds. And that's the fail case, right? So that means that if nothing else in the fight is going correctly, that's what the Special 3 does for you. If you are doing all the things we've talked about, then this is just going to put you into your super mode for longer and with less maintenance. Moving on to the signature ability, Ionic Recharge. During Ionic Overcharge, a lot of Ionic Charges here, I know. But during Ionic Overcharge, you passively regenerate up to 80% of the health denied to the opponent due to them having a reduced regeneration rate. Each tick of this healing cannot exceed an amount of health depending on the rarity of your Nefaria. This scales with base health. You'll recognize this as being very similar to how Scorpion's Sig works, right? You're reducing their regen rate, you're stealing some of that healing for yourself. Now, earlier I called out that Nefaria only builds his resource when the opponent is gaining health due to a buff or a passive. That's true. Willpower doesn't count for that. But once you are in Overcharge, this is looking for any health denied to the opponent, so you will steal their willpower healing just as with Scorpion. Just want to call that out because I realize how you could potentially draw the other conclusion because of what I said earlier. When the opponent gains 20% of a bar of power from a passive or buff within half a second, you instantly gain 50 Ionic Charges and then activate Ionic Overcharge. So this is an easy button built into the SIG itself if your opponent is gaining enough power. Now notice this is 20% of a bar, not 20% of total power. So that's only about 6 or 7% of max power, meaning that this will trigger off of Mystic Dispersion, but you're only going to get those 50 Ionic Charges the first time, right? Because after that, you're going to trigger Ionic Overcharge and reduce their ability power rate. So unless they are just gaining an absurd amount of power and have boosted ability power rates, you're probably not going to double dip too much from this ability. You're probably just going to get the bonus charges, go into Overcharge, and be happy for it. But you might. There isn't a cooldown. Like I said, Nefaria really pops off in some fights. And then lastly, this also triggers, this meaning the gain 50 Ionic Charges and go into Overcharge, when they gain 8% of their max health for any reason within that same half-second window. Again, you're going to enter Overcharge, you're going to reduce their regen rate, you're probably not going to gain these extra charges all that much. But you might, especially if you're facing somebody who is resisting that regen rate reduction, and so they keep healing that much. You're not going to be able to deal with their healing, which is a problem, but you are going to keep gaining charges, and you're going to fuel your own kit very well. So that can still be worth it. Nefaria has definite weaknesses, but you'll notice, especially with this SIG here, there are a number of things in the kit that can kind of mitigate some of those weaknesses. If for some reason your opponent isn't letting you fully turn off their ability power rate, that might be okay, because maybe you're just gaining more charges from it. If your opponent is messing with your ability to reverse their healing, that might be okay, because you might just be getting charges from it, right? And throughout all of this, as you're gaining those charges going into Ionic Overcharge, your opponent trying to gain power or health is going to be feeding you power and health, as well as your resources that let you do damage. So that's what I mean when I say that Nefaria really cares about those target matchups. It's a solid kit in vanilla fights. It feels good to play. Mess around with the evade, figure out how that works for you. But in those target matchups, he's really something special. Moving on to the synergy bonuses here. First up with Iron Man, we have two sides of a coin. Nefaria gets a decelerate debuff whenever an energy buildup is inflicted. These are only 15%, so they start out pretty weak, but if you're in a target matchup and you're stacking up those energy vulnerabilities, those energy buildups, big distinction, then you're also going to inflict a bunch of decelerates, and you're probably going to have a pretty good time answering the opponent's evades or unstoppables. For Iron Man, whenever a prowess is invalidated, you gain an armor up buff, just making him that much better in target matchups. Colleagues in crime with Zemo and the Hood. At the start of each fight, Count Nefaria automatically goes into Ionic Overcharge, but it only lasts half its normal duration, and then in exchange, you don't lose any charges at the end of that first overcharge. You do still get all of the benefits from it, though, right? You won't necessarily have the attack rating or the resistances or the degen resistance, because all of those rely on actually having Ionic Charges, but you will get the reduced regen and ability power rate from Overcharge being active, meaning that this synergy is very good at helping you immediately control a dangerous fight. And then for Zemo, this is a very powerful synergy. Light attacks pause Zemo's root for 0.2 seconds. That's not going to let you hold on to root forever, and you do have to respect the opponent's special 3. But it's definitely going to make building up extra bleeds on the opponent that much easier for Zemo. It's going to make throwing multiple special 1s within the root easier. Generally just a powerful synergy. And then for the Hood, once per fight when the Hood has 0 bullets, he loads 12. Obviously, there is some overlap here with Hood synergy with Mole Man and Co., but you can't always bring them, and sometimes you can bring Nefaria instead, and this serves a lot of the same purposes. It will keep you from running out in quests for the most part. Then we have Back from the Dead with Elektra, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, Black Widow Clairvoyant, and somebody else. And all of these champions, including Nefaria, when they start a fight at exactly 20 or 40% health, they gain a regen buff, giving them some extra missing health. So they revive well. Flavor. Anyway, peak fashion with Doctor Strange, Iron Fist, Mr. Sinister, and Gladiator. All of these lovely caped champions get extra block proficiency. I don't know, maybe they're blocking with their capes or something. Some of them probably literally are. I'm not going to go check right now. And then we have a classic enemies with Professor X, Thor, and Captain America for generic crit rating. Nefaria doesn't really have a relic that he lines up with super well. A lot of the science relics are focused more at physical damage. You can use the Captain America relic just because it has fewer targets generally. That's okay. It'll help you take less damage when your evade isn't online. I think generally his best relic in certain fights is going to be the Spider-Man 2099 one, because it helps you out with that ability power rate control. But weirdly enough, you might want to not use the rune that makes you immune to mystic, or makes you immune to dexterity, because triggering Mystic Dispersion is often going to be a good thing for you. It'll depend on the fight, but just want to call out that wrinkle there. And then, like I said earlier, please run Despair and Inequity with this guy. Just please do it. Anyway, that's Count Nefaria. I hope you guys are excited. I definitely am. It's very fun to play. Like I said, I don't think the kit reads as complicated as some other ones that have come out, including several of my own, but it definitely does have some nuances to it. And it says Ionic something charge a lot. We can laugh together about that. But I think it's a really cool synergistic kit that just plays very well with itself. And I think if you understand the individual pieces and then are able to put them together, it's just going to, like I said earlier, feel incredibly fluid and powerful. So give it a shot. Let me know in the comments what you're thinking, what you're looking forward to. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.